They told us it was an archive. The papers I signed called it climate preservation. The orders said secure and verify. I never saw a single climate chart inside that vault. What I found, what we took down into the dark with us, made every word they fed us into something like theater, a cover for what the government later called, in voices far above ours, a matter of strict security. I'm telling you now because my hands have trembled long enough, and because some things can't stay buried under ice forever. This is a reconstructed, classified-style testimony. I cannot prove everything here as fact. I can only tell you what I saw, what I heard, and what it left me to carry. If you want more declassified reconstructions like this, subscribe now. I remember the day in a way that feels like two times layered on top of one another, the wartime hurry of 1944 and the slow, careful way memory files itself away. The orders came wrapped in a wartime clearness. Move fast, move quiet, acknowledge clearance 3 times over. We were a small detachment, not a division. I was a sergeant then, no different from any other soldier who learns how to follow until the map runs out. Harlan was our security lead, a man whose jaw never loosened into a smile. Moss handled communications, the steady sort, with hands that never trembled around a radio. Finn drove the transport sleds and knew the routes by heart. We reported to Colonel Vance, who stood in civilian overcoat despite the cold, his eyes the color of winter river water, and his voice the kind that made you believe in finality. We left under blackout conditions. Night never truly fell in the Arctic the way it does farther south. It was more like a permanent blue dusk. The world smelled of cold metal and kerosene. We rode in a military transport that coughed and rattled like a tired beast, cutting through the white. Our convoy was small, 2 sleds for men and gear, a heavier cargo sled carrying sealed crates marked with clearance stamps, and a flatbed that carried a compact generator. The only light came from helmet lamps and a map rod between officer and driver. Maps were simple, grid coordinates and a single line of instruction. Vault Echo, maintain radio silence beyond checkpoint. When we arrived, the facility sat half swallowed by snow. It was a black wound in the white, a square of steel and concrete cut into the permafrost, the only sign of human architecture for miles. A single helveted flagpole stood as proof that someone had bothered to stake a claim here. Men in heavy coats and fur caps greeted us, civilian faces, bureaucratic calm. The man in charge introduced himself as Mr. Kessler, the facility director. He had a way of speaking that suggested everything was routine. He must have been well practiced. Dr. Adler, the research lead, looked like he had not slept for days. He had a stack of yellowing schematics and a lamp under his chin.
Colonel Vance's presence made things feel official and brief. There were no jokes. He moved with the measured economy of someone unused to explaining himself. Before we were allowed beyond the outer decontamination tent, Kessler handed each of us a badge, small metal rectangles stamped with the facility insignia and a clearance number. No photographs, no notes beyond what an assigned recorder could take, and above all, do not detach or discuss. That line, do not discuss, was where orders stopped being orders and started being a kind of law. We had protective coveralls, insulated and waxed, and canvas hoods lined with sheepskin. For respiration, they gave us something primitive by later standards, copper-rimmed respirators that made your breath feel metallic in your mouth. They were careful about our hands, insulated gloves, double layers, and a set of thicker gauntlets for the inner levels. Moss tucked his radio away into a belt pouch with the look of a man who had memorized silence. The first door was a slow, grinding airlock. It smelled of oil and bleach, and the pressure equalized with a sound like a small animal deflating. The vault was built downward. Each level sank a little deeper into the earth, as if the world itself had been instructed to close its eyes. There were stairs and a narrow elevator shaft the size of a pantry. We took the stairs because they said it was faster. Our headlamps carved white paths through the gloom, but also made everything appear nearer and more intimate. Rusted bolts, frost rimming a handrail, a dropped tool that hummed faintly in the air like a trapped insect. We passed rooms labeled simply storage, climate archive, equipment. The first level was a museum of industrial stillness. Racks of steel boxes sealed with red wax, humidity gauges with their tiny needles pinned in place, and vacuum-sealed papers that smelled like old libraries. But as we went down, the archive grew stranger. Corridors branched where no one had expected them to, and the schematics Dr. Adler showed us had pencil marks crossing out whole sections with a weary hand. They expanded this after the war plants moved north, he muttered, but there was another sentence he left unsaid. Someone kept digging after the maps were drawn. It was on level 3 that the air tightened and the monitors started to matter. Each door we passed had an environmental panel, small rectangles of glass with lights arranged like constellations. In green, everything read as nominal: oxygen content, temperature, pressure. On the deeper levels, the green gave way to yellow: caution. The panels hummed. I can still remember the way they blinked in sequence, a slow staccato that matched our footsteps. The lights were practical in those days. They didn't have the neat LED glow we see now. They were small bulbs, sometimes coated in frost, and their failure was dramatic. One moment steady, the next a suspicion of wavering that made the hairs on my forearm lift.
We moved into the observation corridor on level 5 because someone had to open the door and someone had to watch. The corridor's windows were plate glass thick as a man's arm and rimmed with rivets. Beyond each window were chambers, cells of sorts, lit with a clinical, ghostly light. Tanks lined up like graves. At first glance, some were empty, their interiors fogged with frost. Others held forms curled into themselves as if sleeping, bodies not quite human in shape, elongated limbs folded with graceless economy, frames too thin for the length of their arms. Some tanks contained instruments, coils, and devices we did not have names for. Others held living things. We were instructed to keep a clinical distance. Dr. Adler spoke in a voice smeared with fatigue and something close to awe. "Do not tap the glass," he said. "Do not speak too loudly. Observe and report." When we peered in, the specimens watched back. Not like animals, like entities that cataloged us with something that felt like measurement. Moss was silent. Harlan, the security man, kept his hand near his holster but did not draw. Finn cursed softly under his breath at the cold seeping through his boots. I remember one tank on the far side behind reinforced steel. It was marked with a placard that had been partially erased and recoded. Unknown, high clearance. The tank was taller than the others, a vertical cylinder of glass and metal with a ring of feed lines and pressure valves around the top. There was frost on the inside of the glass, delicate feathering that looked like an artist had pressed their hand to the cold. Inside, standing against the far wall of the tank, was the first being I would later, in a world that likes its labels short and sharp, call a tall gray. This was not the kind of thing a man forgets. The figure was at least 6 feet from where it stood folded, if you can call that stance, its limbs bearing a proportion that made ordinary clothing or armor look clumsy. The head was large, egg-shaped in the way a child's drawing makes the largest part of the creature the center of thought. The skin, if it was skin, was the color of thawing moonlight, a pallid gray with a translucent suggestion where veins might be. Its arms were too long, hands ending in fine, almost delicate fingers. But what held me was its eyes, enormous ovals of absolute black that drank whatever light came into the room. When it tilted its head, a small motion like a person listening to a distant song, those eyes fixed on me. There is a memory of connection you do not prepare for in boot camp or on any battlefield. It was as if a floodlight had been swung into my chest and the world momentarily held a single note. The being's gaze did not have malice. It had the intention of someone waiting, which is to say it contains the same weight as recognition. For a small, maddening second, I believed it looked at me like an old friend who might at any time say my name. "Do you see that, Sergeant?"
Moss asked behind me. There was no tremor in his voice, only a thinness that made everything sound small. I nodded. Harlan stepped closer, and when Harlan stepped closer, the being's head tilted further still, and there was something, perhaps curiosity, registered like a tiny battery in the space between us. Dr. Adler moved when he thought we might overstay our welcome. He wore goggles pushed up to his brow, and his fingers were stained with something I later learned was antiseptic compound. "Do not interact," he said, but his voice contained other things. Urgency, the wheeze of a man whose plans always come at a cost. We take it down for analysis. We keep to protocol. Protocol. The word held a religion of its own under that glass. They brought out the transfer equipment with an efficiency I had not expected, rolling hoists with makeshift harnesses, coil-lined containment wraps, and a system of straps that looked both delicate and uncompromising. They had instruments for measuring everything, rods with bulbous ends, tubes with needles, a portable gauge that read the ambient ions of the chamber. The younger technicians moved with the hungry fear of those who had been assigned to do a task they had not been taught to question. We, my small team, were there to secure the perimeter and the passageways, and to make certain no one went where the clearance did not allow. As the technicians readied the extraction, the being watched. It reached, slowly, and placed a thin hand against the inside of the glass. Its fingers flattened in a way that suggested contact without pressure, as if testing the glass like one tests an unfamiliar shore for solidity. A hiss escaped from the tank as the transfer specialists calibrated the seals, the scent of ammonia and machine oil in the air.
For reasons I could not then articulate, I leaned forward until the heat of my breath fogged a sliver of the pane near the creature's face. It looked at me. There was no scrambling of animal panic, no animal flight. Instead, that inscrutable head tilted, and the creature made a movement with its body, tiny, like a nod or a bow, and then there was a gesture with its hand. It was not a reach, but a point, the sort of point a person makes toward another when they want to communicate, to draw attention to something. It pointed not at me, but beyond me, past my shoulder, toward the corridor that led deeper. I felt it in the way the body registers a sound before the mind names it, a pressure in the throat, the sudden electrical smallness in the fingertips. "Are you seeing this?" Harlan asked, under his breath. "Yes," I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "It's pointing." No one moved toward the corridor. That was the thing. The room held a kind of polite paralysis. Dr. Adler's eyes narrowed and he barked orders to close off the far doors. Colonel Van stepped between us and the corridor, his broad shoulders taking on the shape of duty.
"No movement," he said, and the words felt like a dam built hastily against a flood. They slipped the harness under the tall gray with an economy of motion that suggested practice. The being did not resist, it did not struggle, and it did not show the sorts of reflexes one would expect if we were dealing with an animal terrified of the world. There was comprehension in every line of its posture, as if it weighed the situation and found it, however reluctantly, acceptable. They wheeled the hoist forward, the metal joints whispering in the chill. The technicians synchronized their movements with hand signals and murmured counts. The tank vented with a soft warning hiss. A ring of steam unfurled like shy ghosts. We moved slowly. The vault's internal lights hummed a kind of clinical lullaby. I can still hear the tiny mechanical beep of one monitor going from green to yellow. The sound was like a metronome keeping time with our breathing. In the narrow passageway, the tall gray's eyes tracked us. Up close, the black was not a simple void, but a surface with depth, as if a night sky had been folded inward. When one technician brushed against the outer harness strap, the being turned its head and made a sound, a low, brief noise that was almost musical and almost mechanical at once. The technicians exchanged looks. "Mark it," Dr. Adler said. "Record everything." Moss put his hand to his pocket and produced a small notepad, a pencil stub, and a pocket recorder with a film-wrapped body. The recorder's microphone had a faint static that made every breath seem like a mistake in the record. "Engineer set say unbroken seal for 30 seconds, Moss murmured into the recorder. I watched the technician's breath condense in the frigid air and then hang, like a curtain, over the creature's head. We wheeled the hoist through an airlock for transfer to a lower containment bay. The doors slid with a heavy sigh and sealed behind us. Inside the transfer corridor, the lights were a colder blue. The tall gray's hand brushed the harness strap, not a hold, more like an exploration, and I thought then how small and human that action was. You could imagine a child doing the same, mesmerized by the movement of its fingers over a new rope. We made it to the inner chamber where the transfer would be completed. The room was wider here, with more armored glass and observation ports. There were instruments on trolleys and a bank of monitors that blinked like a gallery of small suns. The technicians set the harness into a receiving cradle and began the process of moving the being from one apparatus to another. The entire operation felt like surgery performed on a living sculpture. Then something changed, an imperceptible shift at first. One of the monitors, a long strip of bulbs measuring containment integrity, fluttered. It was the microsecond between ordinary function and the knowledge that something had started to slip.
The light went from a steady green to a stuttering yellow, and then back to green. The technicians frowned and spoke in softer tones. We had protocols for this, a checklist Dr. Adler recited by muscle memory. Hold pressure, check seal, recalibrate feed lines, he told the men. They obeyed, hands moving with drilling steadiness. That stuttered yellow made a sound in me. It was foolish to think so much of a blinking bulb, and yet none of us could shake the tiny assumption that the vault had a mood and that its lights were telling us something it could not say with words. Then, as if the air itself had been struck with a hand, a deeper alarm began to sound. Not a shrieking wail, but a low, triple note that made the walls vibrate with a slow, urgent heartbeat. Red lights painted the inner chamber in uneven washes, halogen bulbs flaring and dimming like someone taking rough breaths. The transfer technicians froze mid-motion. A man dropped a pair of tongs and it skittered across the floor with a small, terrified sound. "Contain it," Colonel Vance demanded. "Fluctuation in Sector 5, Dr. Adler answered. He had a tremor in his hands now, one that did not belong to a man of his training. His goggles fogged with breath. "We need to secure secondary seals." Moss clicked his radio open, just a crack, and then closed his jaw.
He signaled to me with a look that meant to hold position and read the order only in his eyes. The triple note alarm deepened into a pattern. Beep, beep, long beep, beep. Footsteps echoed beyond the observation bay. Somewhere above us, doors slipped, and the world took on the shape of a building waking to an emergency it did not want. And then, in the middle of the controlled bustle, the tall gray moved. Not with the slowness of someone being carried, but with a precise economy of purpose. It turned its head, and, as if ratifying an earlier point, it leaned forward and pointed, not at the corridor this time, but at a panel of glass near the ceiling. Its finger was a blunt, elegant thing, and the motion was insistent. In the reflection of the observation glass, I saw the men with their braces and goggles and the gaunt look that comes to people who have worked too long with the same thin idea of what is right. A technician, young, face still freckled, moved to adjust a dial. He had a screwdriver raised. The being's finger tapped the glass with the gentlest of pressures, soundless to those of us caught in human ears, but evident in the way the light caught the contour. The young man paused. He looked at the panel, and then at the tall gray. Then he laughed, a small, derisive thing, as if to dismiss the suggestion of intelligence in the gesture. "You're not pointing to the right thing," he said out loud, more to himself than to anyone else. "Don't antagonize it," Dr. Adler snapped. "Just hold." The laughter was a sound that would lodge in my memory.
It was a sound of someone who had not yet worked out the rules of a room where everything might change in the space of a breath. When the technician's screwdriver slipped, the tool clattered to the floor. The faint clatter galvanized something in the vault, like the twitch of a sleeping animal. One of the outer monitors, an older bank, a strip of bulbs for measuring pressure, faded from green to a jittery yellow and then to red. The red light did not simply warn, it announced. There is a particular geometry to panic in a room that believes itself prepared. People tuck into roles. Someone runs to the telephone bank, someone else slings a harness about a shoulder, and a third checks a valve. Harlan barked the order to ready the secondary clamps. Finn tugged at a cable with white-knuckled patience. Moss crouched near the recorder and kept speaking into it as if words would stabilize the unfolding event. Transcript, vault echo, transfer, containment fluctuation. His voice became the thin spine the rest of us leaned on. The tall gray, still strapped into the harness, stared at the panel it had tapped. Its eyes did not dart or panic. They narrowed with a concentration that was uncanny. Its hand curled into a fist and then loosened. It made a small sound, a pattern of clicks that set my teeth on edge with their regularity. One of the technicians frowned, and like a person trying to decipher bird calls, leaned closer. "Does it?" he began, and then the alarm cut him off. The inner bay's lights went red and earnest, and a trembling began up in the ceiling joints as something shifted against the deep structure of the vault. We were trained for many contingencies, but none of our manuals held a page for the moment a living thing in a glass stared at a panel, and the building itself chose that moment to tell us it was failing. The hiss of vents increased. A support beam somewhere above our heads made a complaining sound, and then a tiny, unsettling snap as if a tooth had chipped. Dust sifted down like old snow and caught in the corner of my eye, making the room look as if it were falling into memory right then and there. "Evacuate non-essential," Colonel Vance said. His voice was flat. When he barked commands, the room obeyed, because men were built to obey a sense of order even when all else unspooled. Dr. Adler moved to the console with a rapidity I had not expected from him. His hands worked the dials with a surgeon's precision and a child's desperation. In the brief seconds that followed, the tall gray turned its head toward me. It did not look frightened. There was a calm, a clarity, and in the space of that look, 100 questions were pressed into my ribs like splinters. Who had put you there? Had you been captured, or were you hiding? Were you a prisoner or a patient? The being's gaze held no immediate hostility, but it held something that felt like accusation.
Not at me, not at the men in the room, but at the larger shape of how we think the world is arranged, one in which we can collect and catalog without asking the hardest questions. I felt the weight of it then, heavier than any pack, and more cutting than any blade. The vault was a place of measures and hierarchies. Every instrument had a purpose, every man had a rank. And yet there, framed by glass and frost, stood something that did not fit the shapes we kept, and that looked at us as if ultimately we were the ones in cages. Then the triple-note alarm sharpened into a sustained, keening tone. The red lights melted into a wash that made the whole room appear as if we had been set inside a porthole lit by a dying sun. I remember the sudden surge of cold, as if a door somewhere had opened to a wind that had been waiting. The technicians spun to their instruments and found them uncooperative. Feed lines that had been steady minutes before now jittered. Pressure needles skittered into angry arcs. The building groaned with a new kind of misery.
"Seal it," Dr. Adler shouted. "Seal the outer locks. We can't afford a breach." Harlan already had a hand on a manual lever. He heaved it with a grunt, and the heavy door shuddered inward, making the room a confined thing. The tall gray watched him do it, and then, with a slowness that felt deliberate, it straightened in the harness, like a man who knew he was about to be judged on how he stood. It made another sound, lower this time, and for a moment every man in that room listened as if a window had opened on a place that spoke with the voice of the sea, low and inevitable. "Ready charges?" Colonel Vance asked, half to Dr. Adler and half to himself. The word charges landed like something that meant finality. The idea of demolition had been kept in the back of every top-secret conversation I had ever been party to. It was the last failing, the hammer answer when nothing else would suffice. I will not claim I knew then what it meant to make the decision to end something by force. All I knew was that orders began to align themselves like stars for a navigator. If containment failed, the vault would be destroyed. If the vault was destroyed, the risk of anything rising from inside would be minimized, though no one could guarantee what would be reduced to embers would stay burned. Those were not my orders to give. My hands, like everyone else's, were full with the work of the moment: straps, clamps, calls. As the men moved, the tall gray lifted its head. It fixed me with those black eyes one last time. There was no pleading in that look, only an urgency that felt older than the war itself. It pointed, again, this time not toward anything in the room, but toward the ceiling, toward the grid of supports that hunched above like tired ribs. The gesture seemed to say, "Watch, beware, remember."
Something struck the far end of the vault then, a concussion that set all the lights to flicker and made a fine thing of plaster rain from the roof. The triple-note alarm became a continuous wail. Men shouted over one another. The machines had started to fail in a pattern that suggested the fault was not merely mechanical, but systemic, as if the vault's very bones objected to what was being done within them. They lifted the hoist in a rush, and for a moment I thought we might have the thing out into safety. The technicians worked like men with their minds on another shore, fast, focused, exhausted beyond reason. We were close to the outer airlock when a secondary panel near the transfer bay convulsed with a shower of sparks. A technician grabbed for a lever, and then his glove stuck to a seam. He cursed and pulled free, his face an ashen mask behind his goggles. A thin red streak traced the ceiling, as if a vein had been severed in the vault's head. It was then that the first physical failure occurred. A feed line burst with the sound of a book snapping shut. The pressure in the tank housing the tall gray dropped in a barometric hiccup. The harness belt tightened around the being as if someone had pulled a strap a notch too far, and the tall gray let out a sound, not a scream, but something that took the shape of alarm. It was brief but complete, and it vibrated the glass cages like a bell being struck. Around us, wires spattered small arcs of light, and the smell of scorched insulation filled the room, making us all taste metal at the back of our throats. Moss's recorder chirped and then clicked in a way I have never been able to replicate in my dreams. The technicians fought with the sensors. Dr. Adler cursed in a language no one taught us and pulled a cover over a console as if hiding it might force the machine to keep its secrets. Colonel Vance barked orders with the practiced cruelty of someone who knows men will keep moving if told to. Harlan grabbed a flanking support and braced the harness, while Finn ran with a hand lamp and a coil of spare strap. We were a tangle of purpose and fear. The tall gray pointed one more time, not at the ceiling or the door or the panel, but directly at me. Its face was a mask where I could read no expression except for the steady, immovable pressure of thought. If the thing had language, it chose not to speak. Instead, it conveyed an insistence, a plea or a warning, I could not distinguish which, that felt like a hand on the back of my neck, guiding. Then the lights went out. Not the slow dimming of power conserving itself, but a sharp, decisive swallow, as if someone had put a hand to the room and closed it. For an instant there was only the green glow of instrument luminescence, and the cold, breathy sound of men breathing into their respirators. The vault's alarms climbed into a higher register, and then beneath the noise, there was the sound that would haunt me, the shift of metal under load, the dull, tearing note of a support beginning to fail. We were halfway through the transfer, and the world grew small and loud at once. The tall gray's finger hovered in the dark where my shoulder would have been. In that tiny, lit window of the observation glass, there were eyes like two holes of colored night, and it looked at me with the kind of calm that some men reserve for prayer. Then, before I could answer, before any of us could answer, the room shook, the alarm shrieked, and men moved as men do when the architecture that holds them together chooses to break. The world shrunk to a handful of sounds: the high, keening alarm, the complaining groan of metal,
the hiss of venting air, and then to a single immense motion, the vault beginning to come apart. Overhead, a support that had been doing its job since whatever hands had built this place set it down, in a sound like a great book snapping shut. I felt it in my boots first, a vibration crawling along the floorboards and up my spine, as if the earth itself were startled awake. Men moved as men trained to do, with purpose, not panic. Harlan barked orders, and I obeyed like the rest. We braced the hoist, checked the harness, pushed. The tall gray, still in the harness, still strangely calm, turned its head and leaned toward me, the same black eyes holding the same impossible weight. It pointed again, once, twice, not at the doors this time, but toward a service shaft whose access panel had been haphazardly propped open for maintenance. The motion was so precise it suggested meaning. I remember thinking then, absurdly, that if a man had ordered me to follow that pointing into a dark, narrow shaft, I would have refused. When an intelligence with those eyes points, the refusal is more complicated. A technician, a wiry man named Lyle, whose laugh had been the bravest sound of the day, moved to comply with the tall gray's invisible instruction. He grabbed a length of cord and leaned in as if to examine the seam where the shaft met the floor. He had grease on his knuckles and a streak of frost on his lapel. For a breath, he was close enough that I could have put my hand on his shoulder. Then the vault gave a louder groan, and the light bulbs overhead made the world feel like a skin shaken. A support beam above us snapped with a sound like a whip. The air filled with a fine grit, shards of insulation, flaked paint, the taste of metal and ozone. The harness screamed against the hoist when the building lurched, and the tall gray made a sound that was more a pattern of clicks than anything I could call a cry. It was small, but it cut through the noise like a bell. "Down," Colonel Vance roared. The command was universal and immediate. Men ducked, tugged the hoist, and tried to move the transfer into the airlock.
But the air was wrong. The corridor had become a river of turbulence. Sparks rained from some panel as if lightning had chosen that old infrastructure for a target. One of the technicians, young, eyes too wide, got a sleeve caught on a jagged rail. He swore, he pulled free, and his glove came away in his hand, leaving him with raw, red knuckles. I grabbed for the harness to steady the tall gray as Colonel Vance seized the radio and barked for an immediate evacuation. The siren jolled into a manic, stuttering pattern. The inner doors slammed, and the pressure changes made everyone's ears pop, leaving a flat ringing behind every sound. For a moment, in that ring, I felt certain I heard the high, thin keening of the small occupants from the other tanks, like a choir of things too small to be fully human. The sound made the breath rasp in my chest. We made it to the transfer airlock with the tall gray balanced awkwardly between hoist and cradle. Men worked in silent efficiency. Straps, clamps, quick checks. There was a tremor that ran through the floor, and a long crack sounded somewhere ahead, as if a fault line had opened in the building's backbone. The lights flared into a sick, strobing red. Dr. Adler was at a console, shouting over measurements I could not fully translate. He kept saying systemic and lattice and overload, as if those words were shields he could hold up against a very practical disaster. Then another alarm, different from the keening siren, sounded deep in the bowels of the vault, a low, pounding pattern like someone hammering a heart with fists. I had the irrational thought that the vault itself was vomiting, that whatever it had consumed was now struggling to get out. A section of the observation bank window separated with a wet pop, and a trickle of condensation raced down like a tear. On the other side, in a neighboring chamber, one of the smaller tanks, occupied by a creature half the size of the tall gray, shuddered as if waking from a long sleep. It pressed its long hands to the inner glass, its face, if I can call it that, suddenly taut with something that read like alarm. The glass bowed. A technician tried to slap a clamp across the seam, but the clamp, chilled and brittle, failed to bite. "All hands out," Colonel Vance ordered. "Now." We abandoned the transfer in the hurry that speed breeds. Straps scraped and chains slithered. I remember the harness slipping and the tall gray's body lurching, a thing at human scale that still moved with an economy and an intention foreign to our reflexes. It did not thrash. It did not take advantage. It simply adjusted, as if to align itself to a new instruction. Then, with a movement that I can only describe as precise to the point of surgical attention, it twisted its torso and reached one long pale hand toward the service shaft again, and with a force I did not have time to measure, pushed. The hatch swung inward, and the tall gray slid, shoulders brushing metal, into the tight dark.
For a second, I thought someone had moved faster to respond than any of us could manage. The tall gray used that slender, delicate hand to haul itself into the shaft with a grace that looked planned, purposeful, and economical. It did not fumble. It did not cry. It disappeared into the narrow passage, and the hatch banged closed behind it with a sound like a gavel. After it, Harlan shouted. He had a look that is easy to remember. The moment when a man who has held himself to a code realizes that code may not apply. His jaw was hard, his resolve set into a thing that felt like iron. Colonel Vance hesitated, then barked a command that to us meant everything. Secure the lift. No men down that shaft without my permission. Seal the passage. Hold position. We did not move into the shaft. We had been trained to obey rank, to follow orders designed to preserve a broader mission. The tall gray had not escaped by luck. It had moved with intent. That intention became, for some of us, unbearable. For others, it was justification enough for the hammer answer we all suspected was being held in reserve. The evacuation became a triage. We funneled out through the outer locks in small groups, shoulders bumping, breath visible. The generator, our little diesel that had coughed us in from the surface, choked out a dying sputter and then went quiet, leaving us to the dim glow of battery lamps. Colonel Vance organized us on the snow-slick ridge above the facility. From the vantage of the white plane, the vault looked smaller, a black wound with smoke licking the rim. Men hunched, hands jammed into gloves, cheeks red and shiny with a frostbite that was more than weather. It was the chill of a moral frost taking hold. A small team stayed behind by order, combat-trained men and technicians whose faces were pale with strain. They were to secure what remained, to set charges if the order came. I remember standing on that ridge and watching their figures move like ants against the black mouth of the vault. The tall gray had gone somewhere we could not follow it without risking more than our lives, maybe risking whatever it was under that class. But the argument for a final measure was already forming, full of military straightness. If we could not safely contain it, we would deny it to any hand that might use it. At dusk, in the kind of cold that makes sound crackle in the space between your ribs, Colonel Vance stepped off the ridge and into our circle of men, his face limned by a battery lamp. He looked at each of us in turn the way a man who must sign a thing looks at witnesses for the act. "Orders from command," he said. His voice was low and flat, and his breath carved visible ghosts. "We are to destroy the facility. If containment cannot be assured, the site is to be denied." The words landed like a verdict. There was a palpable intake of breath across the ridge, as if the cold itself had been inhaled in one shudder.
Adler was beside me then, his goggles up, sleeves flecked with frost. He looked at the colonel with the kind of pleading that feels like a scientist trying to barter for curiosity against a ledger. "There are lives in there," he said, voice thin. "We can secure measures, secondary containment, we can—" "You heard command," Colonel Vance replied. "We cannot take the risk." I watched the men processing the order. Some bent their heads like soldiers who have heard death described as a thing of policy. Others, like Lyle and Finn, stared with the animal confusion of those for whom the equation did not compute. For me, everything slid into slow-motion clarity. The tall gray had looked at me, so had others in those tanks, and the look had weight. It had been possible for an instant to imagine that the creatures understood more than our labels allowed, that they were not simply subjects but something like minds. The order to demolish the site felt to me then like a law passed in a room where the voices of the accused were muffled or absent. We formed a crew to set the charges. It was not an easy thing to say yes to. Setting demolition is a job that charges men with a responsibility they cannot later reverse. The detonator team consisted of technicians who had been briefed on demolition in a dozen different theaters. They carried satchels of small charges, gelatinous blocks wrapped in cloth, wired to blasting caps, det cord spools, and manual time fuses that clicked in the wind. Everything was designed to make a tidy collapse, to reduce the vault to rubble and shroud whatever remained. I volunteered the help, not because I agreed with the order, but because not being present would have been its own kind of cowardice. In the dark, the techs worked like surgeons again. They placed charges at load-bearing points on old supports, across the ventilation hubs, and along the main door frames. They wired in series. Dr. Adler stood at the periphery, hands folded and mechanical with the energy of someone who was counting moments instead of breathing. Lyle, his freckled face drawn and pale, kept glancing toward the shaft. I could tell he wanted to go down, to look for the tall gray, for whatever answer might be sequestered in that body, and yet he kept his feet planted and his hands steady on the charge straps. When the charges were set, we pulled back to a predetermined line on the ridge, 60 yards from the vault lip. Men huddled, shoulders to the wind, hats drawn down. Someone produced a thermos of something that tasted like burned coffee and handed it around. The battery lamp made halos in the snow and picked out the edges of breath in each man's mouth. Colonel Vance called for a final count head. The men who had been inside, those who had slipped out with tools like their lives depended on them, stood with us, their faces etched with the same thin despair. Dr. Adler came to me and spoke softly, so low the wind tried to take his words before they could find me.
"You remember how it looked at the glass," he said. "You saw it. Tell me you saw it." "I saw it," I said. Saying it made my throat close. It looked at me.
He nodded once and drew his gloves tight. There was a look in his face that I have not seen before or since. A scientist who had run up against an ethical wall and had not been given the tool to climb. "If we do this," he said, "we will bury questions that could have other answers." "We can't take the chance," I repeated, but the words were less solid in my mouth than they had been in the Colonel's. The demolition sequence began with the slow, legal-sounding cadence of an army man counting off. The timer was set to a conservative delay, long enough for evacuation, short enough to prevent a possible re-entry. We watched as a small wire box ticked down. The tall gray's chamber was in the middle of the pattern. I thought then about being the middle of anything, about the geometry of decisions that slice through the middle of living things. The box blinked and whirred, a small, unpromising thing that would make massive change. I will not pretend to understand what courage felt like in that instant. The men around me held their faces like masks and spoke casual sentences. I remember that the thermos had gone warm in the hand that held it. I remember Ensign Hargreaves whispering something about how, if you had asked him at the start of the war whether he'd ever be part of a deniability operation, he would have said no. We were all doing things we had not been taught to reconcile. The timer counted down. 10, 9, 8. The tall gray's tank window gleamed stubbornly in that faint light, a small eye of humanity in the structure that desired subsumption. I thought of all the pages we had been told were climate records, all the crates marked with clearances. How many names had been erased by bureaucrats to produce the ledger that let this city of glass be called an archive? 3, 2, 1. The blast did not ferociously tear the earth as I had imagined an explosion would. Instead, it was a long, awful compliance, charges detonating in sequence, supports failing with the precision of old architecture surrendering to a planned finality. There was a single wave of sound that came like a tide, a deep throb that knuckled every bolt in my teeth, and then the vault began to give itself to gravity. For a moment, I watched it as from somewhere else. Steel buckled, great doors folded inward, and the inner lamps winked out in a cessation that felt like breath being pinched. A cloud of white, snow, and insulation, and the bright dust of shattered concrete surged up into the air and swallowed the ridge. Men shouted, of course. Men have to shout when the world they stand on rearranges itself in such a blunt way. The ground tremored, and then the earth engaged the vault with the slow-motion inevitability of winter swallowing a spill of water.
The mouth of the vault closed like a hand over a thing it would not open again. When the dust settled, when a silence that was not the absence of noise, but the absence of the world we had known fell like a blanket, I found myself thinking of the tall gray's last gesture. Point toward the ceiling, toward the supports, toward the architecture that had been complicit in their capture. The gesture had felt like both warning and farewell. I could not shake the sense that something had been cautioned. We stayed on the ridge until the sun pushed itself thin and white beyond the horizon. There were small tasks to do: account for men, sweep for entry points, catalog what gear had survived. Pills of snow dotted with ash made a ghost map of the wreckage. Colonel Vance filed reports by radio with a voice that was now coiled into the spare tone of men who had been the sum of orders before they were made human. Commands came back: proceed to quarantine and await pickup. Men were issued temporary reassignment orders that read like erasures, a bureaucratic way of scattering a puzzle. In the weeks that followed, I watched men peel away from the record. Some were promoted into other theaters where the noise of men fighting was easier to measure. Others were retired quietly with pensions and good references in exchange for their silence. Files were stamped proprietary and sealed. Folders slid into metal boxes with little metal keys that made neat, final sounds in someone's hands. Dr. Adler was reassigned to a research post inland where he could be useful without being inconvenient. Lyle and the other technicians went back to makeshift circuits of repair work. The colonel received commendations that were phrased in the language of prudence. I signed a paper that had the strange archival finality of an oath and a confidentiality clause sewn into legalese. It read like a promise to hold the world as it had been made for us, not as it could be if we dared to excavate. My own life took the curious shape of someone who had been given instruction and then excused from asking questions. I left the service before the end of the war. There were later assignments that read like cleanup: ferrying crates, supervising digs where old equipment was reclaimed, inventorying unmarked boxes that smelled of cedar and antiseptic. My hands did not shake as when I had been a soldier on the ridge, but they trembled in quieter ways that lasted years.
At night, the tall gray's eyes would come back to me, those pits of black that had looked at me as if waiting, and I found small evidence in my drawers that spoke of a man who could not leave a question unprobed, a scrap of frost-smeared glass I had secreted, a photograph with the edges blurred by frost. I had taken it in a moment of weakness before the order to destroy all images. That one page of film lost itself in a developing tray later, but the ghost of it remained. A notation in a pocket ledger that read, Vault Echo, Level 5, Specimen A, Observational Note. The government, whatever veiled command had drawn up the order, which I cannot name here, moved with the deliberate efficiency of institutions that plan erasure. Men were paid handsomely for their silence. I was given a ledger entry, a thank you letter with a seal, and a small check. People who asked questions were told the matter was classified more strongly than others, a poor answer that functioned as a muzzle for men who were not paid in enough absolutes. What nagged me most disturbingly was not the secret itself, but the ethical shape of it. We had surveilled life, catalogued it as specimen, and then decided by fiat that it was safer to bury questions than face them. That logic had the smell of precedent about it. I had been trained to believe in the chain of command, in the calculus that sometimes a decision must be made at a cost. Yet whether that calculus permitted us to reduce a sentient thing to rubble felt like an unanswered arithmetic I could not accept intellectually. There were rumors, of course. Men talked, quietly, in beers and late-night rooms, about what else might have been inside the vault. Some whispered of smaller ones that had jittered loose and had been shot dead as they tried to find the welds of a building. Others suggested that the tall gray had escaped into the ice and had been taken aboard a ship that left without a record. I do not know whether any of those things happened. I only know what I saw and what I was told, and the way rhetoric was used to turn a man like me into a man who closed his mouth for a price. Years passed, and the world kept making other noises. News of battles, tepid victories, monuments. The war ended, and men who had seen things did what they do. They tried to fold the unbelievable into the daily work of living. The vault receded into a rumor that had the power of legend, a story told in bars and in letters, in the kind of gossip that both inflates and erases. I married, I worked at small odd jobs, I learned to keep my thoughts down to a manageable hum. But at night, the same questions came back to me like tides. What had the tall gray meant when it pointed at the supports? Had it been warning us of a failure it could detect because it was built to feel such stresses? Had it been trying to ask for help, or to tell us of danger that lay in our systems, danger we had no right to ignore?
Perhaps its pointing was merely a navigation, the gesture of a creature seeking an exit. Or perhaps it was a message that assumed a language in architectural terms that we could not translate, except by acting the way we do, with the blunt instrument of force. There is a weight to living with an unasked question. You begin to think that silence is its own kind of violence. Men who returned from conflict sometimes keep odd trophies, browned buttons, an old map, a sliver of a letter. I had my small things, the memory of a gaze that recognized me, the scant items I could not bear to burn, the ledger of names that had been scrubbed of explanation. I visited libraries. I sought out men who might know more than I did. Some shrugged and said, "There are files that remain sealed." Some laughed. Others simply changed the subject. Decades later, toward the end of my working life, I received a notice, a polite government letter, the kind they used to make men quiet, asking me if I would attend a formal interview and statement. They told me this was routine, that records were being updated. I went once, because someone in me still thought the truth might be a thing that could be documented into a tidy report. The interview was procedural, steeled with legal counsel. They asked for dates and times and for me to confirm names. Some questions were oddly clinical. Which sector did the energy fluctuation originate from? They had their own language for what had happened, a language that flattened the moral texture into an incident. I gave them what I had, a recollection that was at once honest and made of holes. I spoke without florid embellishment. Memory is a treacherous witness, and I felt compelled to be conservative. They stamped the record, folded it into a file, and slid me a form to sign that would make my testimony the property of someone else's archive. I hesitated at the pen. The form was a litany of non-disclosure and legal absolution. I signed. I remember feeling that what I signed was less for them than for me, a last small accountability before the slow erasure of collective memory. I thought that would be the end of it. It was not. I keep a stack of letters in a drawer, yellowing and quiet. Many of them tell me to forget. Some thank me for my service.
A few, one in particular, had a line that read, "If the files ever surface, be prepared." There was no footnote. The sentence read like a cautionary blessing, a warning disguised as a favor. In the years after that, I heard new whispers: an ice breakup, a line of open water where the permafrost was thinner, a report from a survey team that found destructed ground and a geometry inconsistent with natural thaw. I do not know whether those reports were true in the sense that I can verify them. I only know that the idea of the vault as an act of human question and human suppression had the capacity to become relevant again.
If the permafrost shifted, if the seals the army had once placed failed to hold time itself, then perhaps the vault would be revealed to a world that no longer had the same appetite for secrecy. Sometimes people ask me why I am telling this now. There is a reason, and it is a small one. The conscience stretches like skin, and once it reaches the point where it threatens to strangle, a man chooses to speak. I am old enough that the idea of being silenced by legal threat or by the weight of an institution has less purchase. I have lived long enough to understand that burying a thing does not settle what it asks of us. The tall gray, if it lived, if it had been what we thought, asked with its gestures of what right we had to detain what we do not understand. I do not have the answer. I only have the weight of the question. A reckoning is not necessarily dramatic. It is a series of small recognitions. I have tried to find consolation in the thought that perhaps the vault's destruction prevented a future in which men would have used those specimens for violent ends, but the consolation is thin. There is also the image of small minds boxed and catalogued and then buried beneath a heap of rubble. Which of those things is truer? I cannot know. What I can offer is this: memory and warning. The world we live in is full of things that do not fit our tidy categories. Our instinct is often to contain and classify. That instinct, in the case of Vault Echo, led to an act we have to measure. I carry the memory of that serving as ballast. It is not a claim of proof about extraterrestrial beings. It is a testimony that says, simply, we found something that looked back at us, and we chose collectively to bury it. I will tell you, finally, about the one small object I kept. It is a sliver of glass, about the size of a fingernail, with a faint ring of frost etched at the edge. I kept it not because it proved anything, because it proves nothing, but because it is a thing that hammers at my memory. Sometimes I hold it up to the light, and I can almost feel that black gaze. I do not know whether the tall gray survived that night. I do not know whether any of the other beings did. I do not know if the vault, swallowed by ice, keeps a secret that will remain silent forever. There is one last thing I must say, and it is an appeal I have been too cowardly to make for most of my life. If any of the files that recorded Vault Echo are ever declassified, if you come across them with the cold patience of an archivist or the hungry curiosity of a journalist, look carefully at what the men in those rooms were asked to do. Remember that an institution's need for security can, in its worst moments, become a moral shudder. Ask the hard question: who gets to decide what lives are subject to containment? And if you are given the choice between secrecy that reassures and transparency that unsettles, consider which better preserves the human capacity for conscience.
My hands have trembled with the memory of that tall gray looking at me and pointing at the ribs of the building. Whether it was a warning about failure or an accusation about capture, I have not been able to tell myself that it was anything less than a question addressed to our species. Who do we become when we decide the unknown is a threat rather than an opportunity? Perhaps that was the most damning thing of all. We answered with demolition rather than dialogue. If you found this reconstruction compelling, please like the video and subscribe for more declassified style files. There's another folder, Vault Echo, Annex Notes. If those ever come to light, someone else will tell their version. Until then, keep your eyes on the ice and your mind open. Some truths, once uncovered, make it impossible to go back to older certainties. If nothing else, take care where you dig. Sometimes the ground remembers more than a ledger ever could.